Good morning and welcome to this special YouTube Live. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're watching the replay or you're joining me live, thank you so much. My name is Anuska Taylor and I'm an executive voice coach, Jungian life coach, and also I'm a singer-songwriter. And today I'm going to talk about something that's been coming up more and more in my private work with private clients, which is this fear of conflict. And do you actually avoid conflict? Because it will 100% impact your voice if you do. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, because I'm seeing it more and more. What's interesting is when people work with me initially, it's not something that they will say in the initial consult or the initial call, but it becomes apparent a few sessions in that there's an underlying fear of conflict, male and female. So everyone, I think, across the board. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about why this really matters, how it shows up more broadly, because you may not realize you have a fear of conflict until I start showing you some of the sneaky ways that we avoid it, how it shows up in the voice, but also at the end, I'm going to share how you can actually work with this in the moment. Because obviously the whole point of this work is we want to start to move towards these things that we fear so that we can actually create new patterns, new habits, which are far more empowering versus running away from ourselves and other people, which we all sort of do to a greater or lesser extent when we're coming from ego. So, of course, not everyone fears conflict. There are people out there that absolutely love screaming and shouting and yelling at people. Sometimes it can get physical as well. So they're not generally the people that probably watch my videos, and they're certainly usually not the people that come and work with me. But I do obviously acknowledge that there are people out there that are very comfortable with conflict. It's obviously really going to depend on your conditioning, on your upbringing, what was modeled to you as a child, what was normal for how you handle conflict in your family. And what's interesting with the way that we sort of develop is we either adopt what we sort of saw growing up or we reject it. So if you saw a lot of conflict growing up and you hated it, which was kind of what I experienced, you might find yourself going the other way. Like, I never want to be the person that's always yelling and screaming and shouting. But equally, you might adopt that because you might realize, okay, well, this actually worked. Again, this is all happening unconsciously. You don't sit there and have this conversation with yourself, but you start to realize actually perhaps this works. So just start to ask yourself that question as we go through today. What was modeled to you growing up in terms of how you handle conflict? Was it something that was sort of pushed under the rug, swept away? Let's just pretend this isn't happening. The elephant in the room. Let's just stick our head in the sand. Or was it very confrontational? Was there a lot of screaming and shouting and yelling in your home? And maybe even, unfortunately, maybe physical stuff as well. But of course, if we are running away from conflict, we are really abandoning ourselves because we're not being honest with ourselves. And that is why this really matters from your perspective as a speaker, whether you are speaking publicly on professional stages or whether it's just with your loved ones. If you are avoiding conflict, you are not being true to yourself. You are abandoning yourself because you are actually really afraid to express what you really feel and think. And so what tends to happen is we either just don't say anything and we hope it will disappear or it will kind of work itself out, or we so we either forgot what I was talking about for a moment. So we either push it under the carpet, or we might say something, but we don't really fully embrace it. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, because I think it's just so prevalent in our culture, and often we don't see it. We don't realize how much it's holding us back. The other thing as well is when we are sort of pushing away this sort of fear of or conflict, when we fear conflict, it takes a lot of psychological energy to push it away, because you're always having to micromanage everything that that's going to come out of your mouth, how you're going to show up, what you're going to say, how you're going to be. Well, I can say this to this person, but I can't say that to that person. And a lot of this is kind of what we're taught, where you can say that to that person because they've got a thick skin, but that person you can't because they've got a delicate ego. So we're kind of taught all this stuff as well. And so we end up just feeling really confused and stuck. And as I say, really not being true to ourselves. And ultimately, we're the only person that really suffers, because it's very hard to actually build authentic relationships with anyone if we're not being true to ourselves. We've abandoned ourselves. We've disconnected from ourselves. And we are then putting this falsity out into the world. We're not expressing how we really feel. We're pushing stuff away. And then we might wonder why we don't attract relationships that are really for our highest growth, that are really in our true alignment. And that's why, because we have to be willing to be true. And it takes courage, and it takes a lot of, courage, confidence. So this is a big part of when people fear speaking, and they have a lot of fear around, they'll say to me, I lack confidence with public speaking. A lot of the time it's because they've abandoned themselves. They've abandoned how they really feel. And so they're trying to uphold this persona, this mask, which is exhausting. And that's a big part of my work, actually. So it's not just about the physical voice work, but it's about the emotional aspect, which is absolutely essential, because you are an emotional, spiritual, mental, physical, psychological being, and your voice is in your body. So it's all interconnected. You can't separate any of it. So let's talk about now how it shows up, because again, you might not think that you are conflict avoidant. But actually, when I start to talk about some of these, you might be like, oh yeah, I actually do that. And I think we all do. I certainly do. And I have to catch myself. So what I would say with all of this is it's really about becoming very aware of yourself and your patterns, and being really honest with yourself, because your ego will, without a shadow of doubt, have really good excuses why you do what you do. But you've got to be really honest with yourself. Am I doing this because I fear conflict, or am I doing this because I genuinely just don't want to do this? And you've got to check in with yourself. Am I running away from something? So I've put them into sort of two categories in terms of the fear of conflict. We either tend to err on the side of avoiding conflict or people pleasing. But either way, we're trying to manage, we're trying to control, we're trying to manipulate the external world so we feel safe. So first of all, the avoiding, so common in our world now. And again, I've seen people write this on LinkedIn and stuff, they'll be like, oh, I get so many emails and I don't have time to respond to everyone. So check in with yourself. Are there themes, are there patterns to the kinds of emails that you just ignore? You're like, oh, I can't deal with that person. I don't want to have that conversation. Or is it just people that are keep emailing you that you've already said no to, you've already said I'm not interested, and they keep emailing you? That's very different. But check in with yourself. Is there a part of me that's avoiding having a real conversation? So first of all, I think this is probably more, I used to sort of notice this sometimes in myself when I used to work in the corporate worlds, pre-Melbourne. And, there's people that perhaps you've got a bit of beef with, or there's a bit of a weird vibe between you, and you sort of see them in the kitchen making a cup of tea at work, and you're like, oh, I can't deal with them. I'm just going to come back later when they've left the kitchen. Is that you? Do you see someone ahead of you, like walking to work, and you're like, oh, I'm going to walk a little bit slower so I don't catch up with them and have this like awkward conversation with them? Because we don't want to have the real conversation that we know we really have to have. So we avoid people. So that's the first one. And just start to become aware, because you might do this without even realizing you're doing it, but just check in. Am I not doing that because I don't want to have this conversation? So are you avoiding people? And I'm talking more, I suppose, in the physical sense there. Ghosting is obviously really sort of prevalent now, particularly I think in the dating community. It's like you're chatting to someone online and then you think everything's going well, and then they just disappear. They just stop messaging you, they delete you, or you've actually gone out and met them you have a few messages and they just delete you. There's no conversation. There's no, actually, I'm not feeling this. I'm not really interested anymore. It's just bang, gone. Now, no one likes being on the receiving end of that, yet so many people do it. So again, check in with yourself. Am I someone that doesn't actually have a real conversation with people and probably kind of end things? You know, I'm not interested. It was nice to meet you, but I'm not feeling this. Or do you just delete people or just stop messaging, hoping that they get the message? So ghosting. Are you someone who will text or email versus pick up the phone? Because if we think, oh, I always do this and I don't know how I do this. If we think about it in terms of the vulnerability of communication, the easiest one we can hide behind is emails and texts and WhatsApps and all that kind of digital stuff. That's so much easier. You know, you can hide behind a computer. You don't have to have any kind of contact really, and you can really craft everything you're going to say, and you've got that kind of real barrier. So that's the safest, from the ego's perspective, that's the safest way of us communicating. And then obviously speaking on the phone is the next level up, and then eyeball to eyeball, physically in person, is the most vulnerable. Now, of course, that's not always going to be possible, but again, check in with yourself. Do you avoid having real conversations? Do you avoid picking up the phone? Do you just send someone a text and express something challenging? I'm struggling with this relationship. I don't want to be friends with you anymore, whatever. I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, versus pick up the phone, or even better, actually speak to them in person. Again, there's no judgment here. It's just becoming aware, because I can guarantee you will do something in one of these, because we're all human, we all have an ego, and we're all trying to keep ourselves safe. But I think from my perspective, it's, as I did my live last week about authenticity, this is the first step to authenticity, really. Owning what you feel, owning your thoughts, feelings, and ideas, and being willing to express them, regardless of the response or reaction. And it takes a lot of courage. But also, if you're coming from this higher perspective of your psyche and what you're really seeing in the world, it is a lot easier. So that's a big one, I think, now. And I sometimes, I mean, I'm not going to mention any names, but there's been a few instances over the last few months where, you know I need to have a conversation with someone. They're obviously not really wanting to have the conversation. They're obviously fearing it. So they keep texting me, and then I will text them back and say, let's talk in person, or I will try and phone them, because I know this is me also sort of putting myself out there like that as well. So just start to notice, is this something that I avoid having real conversations with people? Because ultimately what we're really doing is, it's always easier to ignore. From the ego's perspective, it's always easier to ignore something and hope it goes away than deal with it directly. So that's the sort of avoiding side. And I think we all kind of flip-flop between the two, the avoiding, people pleasing, depending on the circumstances, depending on our conditioning around it. So then the people pleasing. So we've got the avoiding, we just avoid it completely. And then the people pleasing. So that looks like over accommodating, saying yes when you really mean no, or saying no when you really mean yes. It could be two sides of the same coin. Over apologizing, compromising on your own needs. Is like, the most important thing to you is that this person is happy, even at my own expense. And not asking directly for what you need or want. I talked a little bit about this last week. So you kind of minimize your own needs. And again, this was very much part of my conditioning growing up. I think particularly, I feel as a woman, often our role, certainly, from a sort of conditioning perspective, over the past sort of few decades, has always been around pleasing and nurturing and taking care of the family and taking care of everyone else. Obviously, that is changing now, but that is still in our lineage, that's still in our DNA. So I think for a lot of women, they really struggle with people pleasing for that reason, because it's been so conditioned into us that is your job as a woman, to keep everyone happy. So do you just avoid asking for what you need? Everything is about making sure everyone else is happy, because as long as everyone else is happy, then I feel safe. But ultimately, I'm really hurting myself at the deepest level. And also another really interesting one in there here is perfectionism. Now, I remember like years ago, I used to see perfectionism as a badge of honor. And I think sometimes it is still today a bit of a badge of honor. But actually, really, perfectionism is more about trying to keep yourself safe, trying to avoid criticism. It's not really about trying to bring your greatest work into the world. It's about how do I avoid being criticized and rejected. So again, all of this is about awareness. That is the first key with everything. Being really honest with yourself about where do I avoid conflict? Do I literally avoid it? Or do I please my way around avoiding it? So if I keep everyone happy, then I avoid creating waves, upsetting people, making people angry, making people cry, fill in the blank. So just start to notice that. And as I said at the beginning, you want to see this in the context of your upbringing, the kinds of messages you got around how your parents dealt with conflict, or whoever brought you up, how they dealt with conflict. And I think, it's this kind of crazy mistake that we think that when we get to adulthood, we've just got all of this figured out. But unless we do the work, we're still operating within our childhood conditioning. We're just now in an adult body, seemingly with our life together, but we're still operating from that sort of child mind perspective. So how this impacts the voice then, I'm going to go to this bit next, because as I say, this is what I start to notice with my private clients, that they come to me, say, I want to feel more confident when I'm speaking. I'm doing presentations at work and I'm speaking at work. But actually, when we start to peel back the layers, as I say, it becomes really apparent that there's a real fear of conflict there. And it's really holding them back in their work. And these are people that are very senior. This is not necessarily people starting out in their career. This is people that have perhaps been in their career for decades. So how this impacts the voice? Well, if you think about it from a very literal sense, when we are holding ourselves back, when we are suppressing our voice, as in what we think, what we feel, the voice is going to follow suit. The voice never lies. So whatever you are thinking and feeling unconsciously, predominantly, because that's what we don't have any awareness of, is going to be shown through your voice. The voice is going to be a byproduct of that. So constriction in your throat, tension, maybe in your upper chest, maybe around your neck, your throat, your jaw, maybe your lips don't really move and you speak like that. So everything is very shut down. Everything's very clamped down because it's not safe for me to express myself. I have to keep my voice in. Because that's what we're really saying when we avoid conflict. It's not safe for me to express. So it's going to show up in many different ways. You may struggle with clear articulation. You may struggle with projection. You may have very sort of shallow breath, but you're not going to get the power, the expression, and the energy in your voice because you're really at war with yourself. As I've said, it's like when we fear conflict, we are really putting a literal sort of brake on our voice and a literal brake on expression because we've decided it's not safe. So the result might be a voice that's powerless, a voice that lacks authority and assertiveness, or a voice that you sort of feel like you've got no control over. It sort of feels, maybe it feels very shaky and wobbly at times. Maybe it feels very quiet and weak at times. It fatigues easily, but you don't feel like you've got any sort of sense of control. It's just, I've got no idea really what's going to come out on a day-to-day basis. So does that resonate with you? Do you sort of see that in yourself, that there's almost this invisible force sort of pulling your voice back? And this is why I say just doing the vocal exercises is not enough. I've done this job for long enough now to see this in other people and also in myself, because you will just not do the work. You won't do the exercises. You won't practice. Or if you do practice, you're not going to fully embrace the exercise. And that's what I see a lot. People will go through the motions, but they're not fully in the exercise. They're sort of half doing it. They've got one foot in, one foot out. And it's because of this unconscious sort of conflict around conflict. So big thing. So why do we fear this? I mean, what is this really about? And from my perspective, and it's really interesting when you start to sort of look at this more deeply, because our fear is really feeling anything sort of negative. We really fear feeling, which sounds kind of crazy. But if you think about any scenario that you're trying to avoid, it's because you're trying to avoid feeling some kind of negative emotion, whether it's being criticized or judged or blamed or shamed or ridiculed. Because, again, coming back to childhood, that is triggering that pattern in you from childhood, that maybe you got criticized a lot or shamed a lot or blamed a lot or ridiculed a lot. And that brings up all of that fear around, I'm going to be rejected, no one's going to like me, I'm going to be unloved, I'm going to be abandoned. It's bringing up all of that childhood sort of abandonment, fear of being left, fear of being rejected. But of course, now we're an adult, we aren't reliant on our caregivers anymore. So we can come now from this higher perspective and with compassion see that child part of ourselves, but we don't have to buy into it anymore as who we are and how we live. So the feeling can be, as I said, so the feeling can be, we're sort of anticipating it's going to be a difficult conversation from the perspective of the person's probably going to be quite angry. Maybe there's going to be a lot of shouting and blaming and yelling, depending on the person. Maybe a lot of ridicule. So there's that side of the fence. So we fear that sort of criticism. The other side of the fence, which I have been privy to and spoken to many people about over the years, is also we fear upsetting people, but more from a place of sadness and grief. So someone's died or someone's going through a really difficult illness, and it brings up a lot of pain in that person, of course. So they might be crying a lot, they might be very sad a lot. And I have experienced this, and I know other people who've been in similar situations have experienced this. You sort of find people disappear because they don't know what to say to you. And what they will say when you sort of speak to them is, well, I don't want to upset that person. I don't want to upset Anuska because she's lost her parents. So that was my experience. So I lost my parents, and people just don't know what to say to you. So they just don't say anything, and they just sort of try and avoid you. And I've had a sort of similar conversations with people that have had sort of really serious illnesses as well. Because when they see me, I'm always crying and I'm always like, my eyes are red. And I at the time, obviously, it was a horrendous experience to go through. But what we've really got to understand is it's really not about me having lost my parents and my sadness. It's about your sadness and your darkness and your fear and your sadness that you're running away from. So this is where the ego is very clever, because the ego will say, well, I don't want to talk to Anuska because I don't want to make her upset because she's lost her parents. So I'm just going to give her some space and not talk to her. I can tell you, you're not going to make me upset because I'm already upset. So anything you say is not going to make me more upset. Similar, I'm sure, if you're going through any sort of really challenging illness, nothing anyone can say is probably going to make you more upset because you're already upset. So you've got to be really honest with yourself, because what you're really running away from is your own pain, your own sadness, and your own darkness. And when you're with me and I'm going through that, it's going to trigger all of that you're trying to run away from. And I think particularly when it comes to sort of death and grief, we don't deal with that very well in our society as it is. We don't really talk about it. It's very taboo. So you see someone that's lost people and you just like, oh, the ego will say, let's just give them some space. But what I'm inviting you to do is go into that and really challenge that in yourself, because those feelings, although I might trigger them in you because I've lost my parents, are not really in me, they're in you, and you've been able to push them away. So if you can go into the experience and, I'm not saying you have to have all the answers, but even just saying to someone to come here for you if you want to talk, I'm not sure what to, even actually saying to someone, I don't know what to say to you because I haven't been in this predicament, but I'm here for you and I'm here to listen and hold space for you, which is essentially what we want. But holding space is very challenging when we haven't done our own work, because it's really triggering all of that grief and that sadness and that fear that we have, that we're trying to push away. The same with the criticism as well. So if we're fearing the criticism and that judgment, that person is not in that person, even though we might think it is. It was always in us. That person's just triggering it, but it was in us to start with. So again, it's about allowing ourselves to feel the feelings, to feel the sadness, to feel the grief, to feel the blame, to feel the judgment, because it's in us and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And the more you run away from it, the more energy you give it, the harder it gets, the bigger it becomes, and the more it impacts your voice, more to the point. Because feelings are directive, not reflective, meaning they're not pointing to your circumstances. They're telling you really where you're out of alignment with who you really are, your truth, your true nature. So when we're feeling a lot of fear and anxiety, it's because we're not really in alignment with the truth of who we are. But again, we're really taught that when we feel anxiety and fear, it's because of that situation or that person has made me feel like that. So we just avoid it, but it doesn't go anywhere. So then the question becomes, how do I transcend this and how do I work with this? Because it's really important that you move towards this and you don't keep running away from it. But first, you've got to be aware that you are running away from it and how you're running away from it. So you've got to make a new choice. It's a choice, it's a decision. It takes a lot of courage. And this is why working with a coach is really helpful when you're going through this, because it's going to bring up a lot of fear, of course, very natural. All of that childhood stuff that you've pushed away is going to now be brought to the surface. So you've got to make a decision. So you're like, okay, there's a person at work that I keep avoiding because I don't want to tell them actually I'm really angry at them, or they've really pissed me off, or whatever the thing is, using that as an example. So you make the decision that I'm going to have this conversation with them. Now, probably in that moment, when you decide to have that conversation with them, it's going to bring up a lot of anxiety in you, because it's going to trigger all of those memories of those experiences in the past where you've had those more confrontational conversations. And that's okay. So first of all, can you be okay with that anxiety and that fear coming up in your body? Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to make any of this wrong, because then we're just pushing it back. Like pushing the beach ball back under the water. It's like, no, stay underwater, stay underwater. So can you first of all be okay with that anxiety and that fear coming up, and take some deep breaths? This is really important. Feel the sensations in your body. It is the opposite to what you will want to do and what we're taught to do. We're taught to distract, run away, avoid. I'm just going to go and get something to eat. I'm just going to go and speak to my friend. I'm just going to go and take the dog for a walk. But I'm not going to be with myself. I'm going to abandon myself. I'm not going to sit with myself and be present with this feeling. It's going to be uncomfortable. It will probably intensify when you bring more attention to it. And that's okay, because that's how it moves through. If you keep pushing it away, you're just giving it more energy. So allow it to intensify. Maybe your heart's going 10 to the dozen. Maybe your throat feels tight. Maybe your stomach feels tight. Maybe your hands are shaking. Maybe, could be anything. And there's really no right or wrong. It's whatever you experience in your body. So first of all, become aware of the sensations in your body, be a witness to the sensations in your body, and allow them to be there. And just breathe deeply into them. So take maybe 5 rounds of deep belly breaths. I talk a lot about deep belly breaths. And it's really brilliant to actually calm the nervous system, to stimulate the vagus nerve, which is also hugely important for the parasympathetic nervous system. It's also essential for our voice. So the more we can stimulate it, the better. But from this perspective, when we breathe deeply, and we really breathe deeply into our belly, and we allow ourselves to sort of feel the feelings and breathe into them, we are getting ourselves out of this fight or flight sort of survival state, and we're getting into a more open-hearted state. So when we're in this place, which is often where we go into, if we're going to have a difficult conversation, we're going into it from that fight or flight state. And we're in attack mode. We're in like, right, I'm going to have this conversation, or I've got to have this conversation. But we're not in our power. So this deep breathing gets us into our power. It gets us into our body, and it gets us out of fight or flight. So then, if you think about it, when we're in fight or flight, we've got tunnel vision. We are very much about, if I'm being chased by a tiger, I just need to get up into that tree as quickly as possible. It's singularly focused, and that's it. I just got to get up into that tree because literally my life is in danger. But we're still bringing that into our modern life when our life isn't actually in danger. So what we're doing here is we're getting out of that tunnel vision, and we're opening the aperture. We're opening the possibilities. And also at the same time, we're opening our heart, we're more compassionate, we're more open-minded in the conversation, which means we're probably going to have a much more empowered, successful, compassionate conversation with the person. And you might be surprised that you get a different reaction from them. And from this place, you listen to them, whether they're crying because you've just dumped them, whether they're crying because someone's just died, whether they're angry at you for something, you just allow them to have their thing. You don't have to take that on. That's their stuff. That's their emotions. That's their thing. It only becomes your thing when you start resisting it and pushing it away. So can you allow them to have their thing? You own your feelings and your emotions. And then from this calmer place, you can express yourself in a far more confident, powerful way with far more clarity. And I guarantee you will have a very different conversation than if you go into it from that fight or flight mentality. The other thing as well is this is a journey, this is a process. If you're not used to doing this, it's going to be a bit messy the first few times, maybe many times. Your heart might be going a lot. Maybe your hands are shaking when you're having the conversation. I know for me in the past, when I've had conversations like this, I've done this process, but my hands are still shaking in the moment because I've been so wound up about something. But be okay with that. Be okay with it being a bit messy. Be okay with, you not being completely confident and feeling really courageous. It's okay. But the important thing is you just make a new decision and you start. And that's the most important thing, because it will get easier because your nervous system starts to accept, okay, this isn't actually life-threatening like I thought it was. And then you start to be more open to having more challenging conversations. You give people their space to say their bit, and then you say what you really think, not people pleasing, not avoiding. You say how you feel, but it comes from a much more heart-centered place, versus when we're in that fight or flight place, it's ego-driven, it's defensive, it's reactive. It's, I'm so annoyed at you. It's everything that we don't want really to actually build relationships and create connections with people. So I hope that this has really helped. As I say, I was inspired to do this because it's coming up more and more with my private clients. And I think it really impacts everyone to a greater or lesser extent. So let me know how you go. And just, if nothing else, just start to become aware of where you hold back from being really honest with how you feel. And again, it's not coming from that defensive ego place. It's coming from an open-hearted place. You can do it from a place of compassion and heart-centeredness. The ego does it, and when the ego does it, it's very defensive and very reactive. So you know where you're sort of coming from in terms of how you deal with it. But again, no judgment, just be with yourself where you are. Now, if you are interested in going deeper with this, because I would argue this is the essential piece in freeing your voice, you can do the voice exercises, brilliant, very important, but this is underpinning everything. Then I would love to work with you. I have a really transformational private voice coaching program, Speak with Impact, which is an intensive initial 2-month program followed by 6 months of support. So it's an 8-month container in total, and it's a £5,000 investment, but life-changing. It will change the way you show up, how you feel at work, at home. You really can't put a price on it. From that perspective, it will change everything, and it will really just open your mind to the world and how you've been seeing it through such a limited lens, and how you're really holding your voice back. And it will really start to kind of free you to really step into your true power and your true authentic voice. So if you're interested, you could send me a message through my website, anuska-taylor.com, or just book a 30-minute voice strategy discovery call. We'll talk about it. I can answer your questions. I can give you some insight and help you to become more aware of your voice and how I can support you moving forward. So if not, there are lots of other options below. I've got a new course that came out last week, all about this stuff, to be honest. And of course, you can also just book a one-off casual coaching session, but all the links are below. If not, I will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a wonderful weekend.